Well, with more insight on all that's been announced today by Apple, I'm joined by RIch Tehrani. He's Group Editor-in-Chief of the tech news site TMC. Welcome back to the show.
How are you?
Good, thank you. So as we look at some of the highlights, what are you expecting that's going to be really buzzworthy from this year's Apple Developers Conference?
Well, there really was a lot. I think the high-end Mac Pro was amazing. The monitor was amazing. The price tag, a fully loaded system is going to cost around $35,000. That was incredible. The privacy options also were pretty amazing. Some of the things you can do with AirPods, with Siri, being able to answer phone calls, send text messages. There was just so much. I think another really interesting piece was the iPad OS, the separate operating system for the tablet. I thought that was a great move as well.
Now, looking at a lot of these new products and hardware that was released, do you think Apple is really ahead of the game, or are they late to the party compared to rival tech companies like Huawei, Xiaomi, and Samsung?
In some ways, they're behind. For example, a foldable device. The size of the devices aren't as big as a lot of the Android competitors from Asia. But what Apple does is they tend to focus more on the user experience and their ecosystem, which they have more control over. And so in some ways they're behind, but in other ways they're ahead in usability and ease of use, for example.
And we also saw there was a software update announcement to the iOS. What are the highlights and lowlights, so to speak?
Of the software, well, there was dark mode, which will save some battery for users. It's a more slick interface. I mentioned the iPad OS. I thought that was really interesting as well. The augmented reality was great. Lots of different things you can do with that. More powerful devices, of course, are going to help and have helped with augmented reality. There was a Minecraft demo that blew most of the audience away, and I was impressed. So, I mean, there's really so many things that Apple's doing with its software. Maps, they've really upgraded Maps amazingly in terms of how smooth the scrolling is. If you want to go forward down a street, it's as smooth as anything I've ever seen, probably smoother than the competitors at Google.
And we also saw some compartmentalizing, for example, the changes that we saw with iTunes. What can consumers expect there?
Well, it was a mess. iTunes was really a confusing jumble of garbage, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's just it grew and grew and grew, and even Apple on stage kind of made fun of themselves, and they realized they needed to break this up into 3 separate apps. And I think it's smarter for consumers because when you're downloading your podcast, you don't necessarily want to know about your TV or your radio. These are separate applications in the mind of the consumer, so they should be separate applications on the screen for the consumer.
Let's also talk about the wearable market in terms of not just Apple's market share, but also its competition with its rivals. What stood out to you?
So what we've seen in the first quarter reports are that Apple's growth rate was around 50%, and Huawei was 280%. In terms of the market share leadership, you've got Apple in the lead, and then Xiaomi, and then Huawei. And so I think what we're going to continue to see is that the ecosystem matters. Now, there are some hiccups right now with Asia in terms of what's happening with Huawei and whether people are going to go out and buy Huawei devices or accessories to go with the phone. I think they're kind of in limbo there. But Xiaomi, at least for the short term or the long term even, they're in a good position in terms of building out that ecosystem and selling a lot more wearable devices.
And we also saw a heavy focus on privacy. So talk a bit about the privacy and the data collection, not just some of the improvements, but also the concerns that came with some of these Apple updates, as well as the wearable devices.
So I've got to say, what Apple did today with these disposable email addresses to some degree, and the ability to log into websites anonymously, they've really taken privacy by the horns, and they are the leader right now in privacy. Google is not known for privacy. They just don't have that reputation. If anything, they typically use your data to sell against it or to give access to advertisers and marketers. So right now, the leadership position in privacy is in Apple's hands, and you would imagine that would extend into their wearable devices as well, their watch, as well as headphones and other devices.
All right, always good to have you on. RIch Tehrani there, Group Editor-in-Chief of tech news site TMC.
Thank you.